The atmosphere shifted, the applause faded, and was replaced by an unsettling tension in the room. Suddenly, the boos began, loud, unapologetic, and relentless.
I came here to speak to this man, not your security. You have failed me.
Thank you. Okay.
I've been a Labour voter my entire life. You have failed to be the opposition. You have failed to ask whether lockdown was functioning.
Just behind. Can we just
Do you understand?
Shall we
go on in?
Thousands of people have died because you have failed to do your job and ask the real questions. Well, I am telling you now, and I hope this goes out, you have failed this country. You have.
They've been on the front line keeping people alive. So I really don't need lectures from you about this pandemic.
You've got one. Why?
Can we come in? Okay.
What are you doing?
Good, thank you.
He's the landlord. That man is not allowed in my pub. He's the landlord. I'm not going to physically hurt him. That man. That's assault. I am not.
Keir Starmer stood there with a look that clearly showed he was caught off guard. This wasn't just a few scattered noises, this was a wave of rejection, an unmistakable and clear message that people weren't pleased with the Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, conference. Thank you, conference.
True democracy is citizen-led. Politics needs an update. We demand a people's house. We demand a people's house. We are in crisis. We are in crisis. Our whole future is in jeopardy.
So what went wrong at Southport? Was it his stance on the Gaza ceasefire, his economic promises that fell flat, or his sudden shift on Brexit? Or was it something deeper, something that made even lifelong Labour supporters feel disconnected from a leader? Let's break it down.
Minister, how many more children? How many more children, Prime Minister? Are we going to do something? Time to change, Starmer. Come on, needed. How many more children? Is it mine next? Are you going to stand up for our children? That. Bye-bye. Got your photos, off you go. Make a real change, Prime Minister.
Get something.
Make a real change! Get our children! Go away!
I just found out my friend's 9-year-old daughter was killed.
You're not wanted!
Scumbag! The person I've held as a child and
Who said it was for Who was it?
Keir Starmer arrived in Southport expecting a warm reception from the crowd. After all, he is the Prime Minister. But the reality was completely different from what he expected.
The programme Prevent, the same programme that Axel Rudikabana was referred to 3 times before he stabbed children to death. Now, before I get into the details, we approached the government earlier today about what I am about to reveal. They hadn't decided on their response to this report. Well, it looks like they've been spooked into one, and in the last few minutes have decided to reject the advice. Left to their own devices, though, who knows? Well, earlier today I came into possession of a leaked roundup of this Prevent report. Now, I hate to tell you this, but it looks to me as though this report is using the Southport attack as a way to, yet again, downplay the threat of Islamist extremism and increase the chances that someone could be classed as far right. The roundup appears to give radical Islamist extremism the same amount of page.
His speech was meant to rally support for the government, but it turned out to be a complete disaster. His words ignited such a reaction. At first, it was just a few uncomfortable shifts in seats, some uneasy side glances, and a silence that didn't feel like respect, but hesitation.
With a roundup of the developments today in the case of the Southport incident that saw 3 little girls stabbed to death at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class. The suspect in that case is 18-year-old Axel Rudikabana. Today, police announced that he was facing 2 new charges.
The 2 further offences relate to evidence obtained by Merseyside police during searches of Axel Rudikabana's home address as part of a lengthy and complex investigation which has been ongoing since the 29th of July. The additional charges are the production of a biological toxin, namely ricin, contrary to Section 1 of the Biological Weapons Act 1974, and possession of information, namely a PDF file entitled Military Studies in the Jihad Against the Tyrants, the Al-Qaeda Training Manual, likely to be useful to a person committing or preparing to commit an act of terrorism.
Initially, people weren't sure how to respond. Then, from the back, a loud, unmistakable boo rang out, and that was the turning point.
The events today are just truly awful, and I know the whole country is deeply shocked at what they've seen and what they've heard. And I know I speak for everybody in the whole country in saying our thoughts and condolences with the victims, their families.
The hesitation of the crowd quickly evaporated, and murmurs quickly escalated into full-blown heckling. Some in the crowd shook their heads, while others began to leave. Even as Starmer continued speaking, it was clear the crowd had already made up its mind they weren't with him.
Is marauding mobs on the streets of Southport, attacking the very same police officers who responded to the awful attack on those girls, who I met for myself that next afternoon when they'd all come back into work, notwithstanding what they'd been through the day before, only then to be met with violence by the thugs who have no interest whatsoever in the raw pain of the community in Southport.
This wasn't just a poor reaction, it was outright rejection, and once the crowd turned, there's no winning them back. But what exactly sparked this outrage? Let's break it down. The first sign of trouble began with the situation in Gaza. It was the moment that pushed the crowd over the edge. Starmer addressed the Israel-Gaza conflict and, instead of calling for a ceasefire, a stance many in the audience supported, he firmly opposed it.
A support package for Southport. Keir Starmer met with local leaders in the town today to confirm a package of support for the local community following those appalling killings. He said the package will equip local leaders and agencies so that the right support is in place for victims, ensure the needs of bereaved families are at the heart of the response, and drive longer-term efforts to bring the community together. Now, he met with Metro Mayor Steve Rotherham, Chief Constable Serena Kennedy, and other leaders drawn from local policing, faith groups, healthcare providers, also from the voluntary and education sectors, where they all discussed next steps and the importance of working together to really help Southport recover from what have been horrific events over recent days. Sir Keir Starmer also travelled to Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool, where he thanked staff there for their hard work looking after some of those little ones. He said, as a nation,
He reasoned that a ceasefire would only freeze the conflict, giving Hamas the chance to regroup. But that argument didn't land as he had hoped. The crowd wasn't just disappointed, they were enraged. Shouts rang out, people questioned his stance. Some held up signs and others booed so loudly that parts of the speech were drowned out.
Tragedy of the Southport killings must be a line in the sand for Britain. We must make sure the names of those 3 young girls are not associated with the vile perpetrator, but instead with a fundamental change in how Britain protects its citizens and its children. In pursuit of that, we must, of course, ask and answer difficult questions. Questions that should be far-reaching, unburdened by cultural or institutional sensitivities, and driven only by the pursuit of justice. That is what we owe the families. The responsibility for this barbaric act.
But things were just getting started. For many, this wasn't just about politics, it was about human lives. His refusal to call for a ceasefire was seen as siding with the wrong side, and at that moment it was clear he wasn't speaking for the voters. This wasn't a single misstep, it was part of a larger problem. When Starmer moved on to discuss his economic plan, things only got worse.
That the situation in Gaza is intolerable, and that the world will not look away as innocent civilians, including women and children, continue to face death, disease and displacement. Mr. Speaker, it cannot go on We need an immediate ceasefire. Hostages out, aid in, a huge scale-up of humanitarian assistance. That is the policy of this government, and an immediate ceasefire is the only way to achieve it. So we will do all we can in pursuit of these goals, which is why, as one of the first actions taken by this government, we have restarted British funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency to deliver that crucial humanitarian support.
After the backlash over the ceasefire, Starmer attempted to shift gears. He spoke about fixing the economy, promising growth, stability and a better future. But the crowd wasn't buying it. His words felt polished, almost rehearsed, like a politician saying what he thought people wanted to hear. But the crowd wasn't convinced. They weren't looking for vague promises, they wanted real answers. So, someone shouted how, and another asked where's the money coming from. Instead of inspiring hope, his speech came off as empty rhetoric. For years, people had heard the same promises, including lower taxes, better wages, and a stronger economy, but nothing had changed. Bills were still high, wages were still low, and trust in leaders had reached an all-time low. As the heckling grew, it was clear Starmer wasn't connecting with the crowd. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, he touched on Brexit. And that's when the anger truly erupted. If there was one topic that could push the crowd from frustration to outright fury, it was Brexit. Starmer had once been a staunch advocate for a second referendum, fighting hard to keep the UK in the EU, but now he was telling people to move on. You see, that was a problem.
Speaker, I know that, like everyone in the House, the Prime Minister is an honourable member. On that basis, can he repeat his assurances that all rules were followed while the country was in Tier 4 lockdown in December 2020, not just by him, but...
To Brexit supporters, it felt like a slap in the face. They had fought for years to leave the EU, only to hear Starmer dismiss it as an outdated argument no one cared about anymore. To those pro-Remain supporters, it was a betrayal. They had backed him believing he would stand by them, but now he was walking away from the fight. Irrespective of where people stood on Brexit, everyone felt let down, and the crowd made sure he knew it loudly. But just when it seemed things couldn't get any more awkward, Starmer made a move that left even his most loyal supporter speechless.
And the United Kingdom. I would like to send my warmest congratulations to President Trump on his inauguration as the 47th President of the United States. For centuries, the relationship between our two nations has been one of collaboration, cooperation, and enduring partnership. It is a uniquely close bond. Together, we have defended the world from tyranny and worked towards our mutual security and prosperity. With President Trump's long-standing affection and historical ties to the United Kingdom, I know that depth of friendship will continue. The United Kingdom and the United States will work together to ensure the success of both our countries and deliver for people on both sides of the Atlantic. Since our first meeting in September,
if there was one thing no one expected, it was Starmer praising Donald Trump. For years, Labour had been one of Trump's fiercest critics, with Starmer himself speaking out against him on multiple occasions. But now he was praising Trump's role in the Middle East. The room went cold. Some people laughed in disbelief, while others booed loudly. Was this really the same Starmer who had once opposed everything Trump stood for?
the image of thousands of Palestinians literally walking through the rubble to try to find their homes and their communities in Gaza. They must be allowed home. They must be allowed to rebuild, and we should be with them in that rebuild on the way to a
The shift was too sudden, too strange. It felt as though he was trying to appeal to everyone at once and failing spectacularly. Labour supporters, particularly younger voters, were stunned. This wasn't the party they had signed up for, and if there was one thing worse than a politician they disagreed with, it was a politician who flipped his views just to please the crowd.
Has said that Labour has lost the trust of Muslim voters over Labour's policy on Gaza. Is she right?
I think everybody can see that the conflict in the Middle East has caused great concern
At that point, Starmer had completely lost the room, and the backlash didn't stop when the event ended. It quickly spread far beyond the room, growing into a storm of criticism. Overall, one thing is clear. If Starmer doesn't turn this around quickly, Labour could be heading for an election disaster, and Southport will be remembered as the moment it all began to unravel for him and the Labour Party. If you enjoyed this political content, like the video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating political content.